The morning seemed like any other, quiet and unassuming. For Margaret O'Connell, 72 years old, every step she took was guided by her unwavering trust in her loyal companion, Ace. Ever since she had lost her vision, Ace had become her lifeline, her protector, and her eyes in a world shrouded in darkness. Ace, a strong and steady Belgian Malinois, had always been calm, dependable, and alert. But that morning, Margaret sensed something unusual. His stride faltered, his movements became rigid, and for a brief moment, Margaret felt an unsettling chill run through her body. Then came the sound. The deafening roar of a motorcycle engine shattered the stillness of the street, tearing through the air like a warning. It was so close, so loud, that Margaret instinctively froze. Ace, standing beside her, stopped abruptly, his body stiff as a statue. He planted himself firmly between Margaret and the approaching noise. The motorcycle came barreling down the narrow street, weaving recklessly through traffic, until the rider slammed the brakes just feet away from the pair. The screech of tires burned through the air, and Margaret could smell the sharp, acrid scent of rubber. "Get your stupid dog out of the way," the rider shouted, his voice dripping with hostility. Margaret gripped Ace's leash tightly, unsure of what was happening but certain that the man's anger was directed squarely at them. She could feel Ace's tension through the leash, his body coiled like a spring, his focus unbroken. The motorcycle engine went silent, but the sound of heavy boots stomping on the pavement sent Margaret's heart racing. Each step felt closer, louder, and more threatening. "You almost made me wreck, you dumb old hag." And this useless mutt, the man's voice cut through the air like a knife. Margaret opened her mouth to respond, but her words failed her. Then, without warning, she heard it. The sickening thud of a boot making contact. Ace had been kicked. The leash tugged sharply in Margaret's hand, and her breath caught in her throat. What the man didn't know, what no one on that quiet street could have known, was that Ace wasn't just a guide dog. Before Margaret, Ace had served as a highly trained canine. He had faced threats far greater than an angry man. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. Ace stood still, processing, calculating, his body taut but unmoving. He wasn't a violent dog. He had been trained to act only when necessary. But now, Margaret's safety was on the line. And when it came to protecting her, Ace's instincts were second to none. The street fell silent, the echoes of the man's angry voice fading into the stillness. Margaret's hand trembled on the leash as she tried to process what had just happened. Ace hadn't moved. Not yet. But Margaret could feel the tension radiating from his body. The calm, steady dog she relied on felt different now. She could sense it in the way his muscles were drawn tight under the harness. Ace wasn't just standing still. He was waiting, watching. "Do you hear me, lady?" the man snapped, his boots scraping the pavement as he stepped even closer. "Keep that mutt under control or I'll—" Margaret didn't need to see the man to feel the heat of his anger. It was suffocating, surrounding her like a heavy fog. She clutched the leash tighter, her voice shaking as she tried to calm the situation. "Please," she began. "We didn't mean to—" "Didn't mean to?" the man interrupted, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "That dog should be locked up." His voice grew louder, more aggressive, and with every word, Margaret felt smaller, vulnerable. But Ace wasn't vulnerable. His sharp, golden-brown eyes were locked on the man, studying him. The way the man's body shifted, the loud, threatening tone of his voice, the aggressive way he moved, it all told Ace the same story. This was no ordinary situation. This man wasn't just angry, he was escalating. Ace could feel Margaret's fear through the tension in the leash, and that fear only sharpened his focus. "Stupid dog," the man muttered again. But this time, his voice had an edge of hesitation. He noticed something in Ace's posture, something he hadn't expected. Ace wasn't cowering. He wasn't barking. He was simply watching. Margaret tried to take a step back, pulling Ace gently with her. "Let's go," she whispered, but Ace didn't budge. His training was ingrained, deeper than instinct. In his years as a canine, he'd been trained to remain calm under pressure, to assess every threat before acting. And this man, Ace had already decided. He wasn't safe. What's the matter with him? The man spat, taking another step forward. You'd better. Ace shifted slightly, his ears perked, his gaze unwavering. It was a subtle movement, but it sent a clear message. Enough. The man hesitated, his bravado faltering. He hadn't noticed it before, but now he saw the way Ace stood, balanced, ready, like he was waiting for something. For a moment, the man seemed unsure of himself. Margaret felt the tension in the air shift. She didn't know what Ace was doing, but she trusted him. She always had. Let's just walk away, she said, her voice firmer this time. But as she tried to guide Ace, he refused to move. He wasn't done yet. The man scoffed, trying to mask his hesitation. Whatever, he muttered, turning back toward his motorcycle. But as he moved, Ace's head tilted slightly, his ears twitching. There was something in the man's posture, something Ace didn't like. The man reached into his jacket pocket. The moment the man's hand slipped into his jacket pocket, Ace reacted. It wasn't a panicked movement or a reckless response. It was calculated, controlled. His stance shifted, his muscles tensed, and his eyes locked onto the man like a laser. Margaret couldn't see what was happening, but she could feel it. The leash in her grip had become taut, not from fear, but from readiness. Ace was waiting, assessing, preparing for whatever was about to unfold. The man faltered. He had expected submission. He had expected weakness. Instead, he was met with something entirely different, something that made him hesitate. Ace wasn't barking, wasn't lunging. He was simply watching, still as stone, like he had already calculated every possible outcome. For the first time, a flicker of doubt crossed the man's face. Margaret took a shaky breath. Please, she said, keeping her voice calm. There's no need for this. She didn't know what the man was reaching for, but she knew one thing for certain. Ace did. This was what he had been trained for. His years as a K9 had taught him to recognize threats before they happened, to anticipate danger before anyone else could. He wasn't just reacting to the man's movements. He was reading his intentions. A long, tense moment passed. Then the man exhaled sharply and withdrew his hand. Empty. Ace didn't move. His gaze remained locked, his body still brimming with quiet intensity. The air between them felt charged, as if a single wrong move could shift the entire balance. The man scoffed, trying to mask his hesitation. Damn dog, he muttered, stepping back. His voice had lost some of its edge, and Margaret knew he had felt it too. The shift in power, the loss of control. Margaret's grip on the leash loosened slightly as she felt Ace relax just a fraction. The immediate danger had passed, but she knew that whatever had just happened, whatever Ace had sensed, was far from over. There was something off about this man, something that didn't sit right with her. And deep down, she had the unsettling feeling that this wouldn't be the last time their paths would cross. The man climbed onto his motorcycle, revving the engine loudly as if trying to reassert himself. He lingered for just a moment before peeling away down the road, the roar of his bike fading into the distance. Ace watched until the very last second, standing firm, unshaken. Margaret reached down, running a gentle hand over his head. "Good boy," she whispered, but in the pit of her stomach, a cold unease remained. Something told her that this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. The world around Margaret slowly returned to normal, but she couldn't shake the uneasy feeling settling deep in her chest. Ace had relaxed, but only slightly. Even as she turned to continue their walk, she could sense his heightened awareness, his ears still twitching at every sound. She ran a hand gently over his head, feeling the warmth of his fur beneath her fingertips. "Let's go home, boy," she murmured. But in truth, home didn't feel as safe as it had that morning. As they made their way down the familiar sidewalk, Margaret replayed the encounter in her mind. The man's voice, the anger in his words, the way he hesitated when Ace stood his ground. And that moment, his hand in his pocket. What had he been reaching for? A phone? A knife? Something worse? She couldn't be sure, but Ace had known. His reaction had been instant, as if something deep inside him had switched back on. He had spent years protecting officers in the field, and today he had protected her. The distant hum of a motorcycle engine made her breath hitch. Ace stiffened. Margaret's grip on the leash tightened, her pulse quickening. She turned her head slightly, straining to listen beyond the usual sounds of the city. The engine revved, then faded again. Was it the same man? Was he watching them? Her mind raced, but she forced herself to keep moving. She refused to let fear control her. When they finally reached her small brick house, Margaret let out a slow breath of relief. She unlocked the door and stepped inside, her hand instinctively brushing against the table near the entrance. Everything was in its place, familiar and comforting. But Ace's posture hadn't changed. He remained near the door, his ears alert, his body still. She knew that stance. He wasn't just being cautious. He was waiting. Margaret set down her bag and reached for the phone. Her fingers hovered over the buttons, debating. Should she report the man? She didn't know his name, didn't have any real evidence that he was dangerous, but something inside her told her this wasn't over. Ace's reaction alone was enough to convince her that this wasn't just an angry stranger. They had encountered something much more unsettling. She sat down slowly, exhaling as she ran a hand through her graying hair. "What do you think, Ace?" she asked softly. He finally turned to her, his deep brown eyes meeting hers. He didn't whine, didn't move closer. He simply stared, as if waiting for her to understand what he already knew. The threat wasn't gone. It was still out there, and sooner or later it would return. That night, Margaret found it impossible to sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she heard the man's voice again, angry, threatening. She could still feel the tension in the air, the way Ace had gone rigid beside her. She had lived in this neighborhood for nearly 30 years, had walked these streets without fear. But now, for the first time, her own home felt different, less safe. Ace lay near the front door, his body stretched out but his ears twitching at every sound outside. He wasn't resting. Margaret knew his training had kicked in, and even in retirement, he was still a protector at heart. She wanted to tell him to relax, to come lie by her side like he usually did. But she knew it wouldn't make a difference. Ace wouldn't let his guard down, not tonight. A noise outside made Margaret freeze. A slow, deliberate sound, like footsteps on gravel. Her breath caught in her throat. She reached out instinctively, her fingers brushing against the armrest of her chair. Was she imagining it? The street was usually quiet at this hour, but now every small noise seemed magnified. Ace lifted his head, his body tensing. She swallowed hard and reached for the phone on the table beside her. Should she call someone? Was she overreacting? She didn't want to be the paranoid old woman calling the police over nothing. But she trusted Ace more than she trusted her own instincts. If he sensed something, she had to believe there was a reason. She ran her fingers over the buttons, hesitating. Then a low growl. Ace's body stiffened completely, his gaze locked on the door. Margaret's pulse pounded in her ears. She had never heard him growl like that before. It wasn't loud, wasn't aggressive, it was controlled, restrained. A warning. Her fingers clenched around the phone. She no longer felt unsure. Taking a deep breath, Margaret made her decision. She pressed the call button. Margaret held the phone tightly, pressing it against her ear as the ringing echoed in the silent house. Ace remained perfectly still, his body poised like a coiled spring. His eyes never left the door, his ears twitching at the faint noises outside. Margaret swallowed hard, her fingers trembling slightly. She had spent her entire life being independent, never the type to panic. But tonight was different. Tonight, she wasn't alone. 911, what's your emergency? The dispatcher's voice was calm, professional. Margaret exhaled shakily, trying to steady herself. I think someone is outside my house, she said, keeping her voice low. I don't know if they're still there, but my dog, he's trained. He senses something. There was a pause, followed by a reassuring response. Can you describe what you heard, ma'am? Any movement? Voices? Margaret listened carefully, straining to pick up any sound beyond her own pounding heartbeat. Silence. Had she imagined it? She almost second-guessed herself, until Ace let out another low, rumbling growl. Margaret tightened her grip on the phone. "He's still alert," she whispered. "He doesn't do this for no reason." The dispatcher's tone shifted slightly, more serious now. "We're sending an officer to check the area. Stay inside. Keep your doors locked. If anything changes, call back immediately." She nodded, even though no one could see her. "Thank you," she murmured before ending the call. Her hands were still trembling as she set the phone down. Ace hadn't moved. If anything, he seemed even more focused, his breathing slow and steady. Margaret could only imagine what was running through his mind. Calculating, analyzing, waiting for something she couldn't see. Minutes felt like hours as she sat there, her fingers brushing lightly over Ace's back for comfort. The distant wail of sirens finally broke the heavy silence. Whoever had been out there, if there had been someone at all, would soon know they had picked the wrong house to lurk around. But deep down, Margaret knew this wasn't over. This was just the beginning. The distant wail of sirens sent a shiver through the night air, piercing the eerie silence that had settled over Margaret's home. Ace didn't relax, not even for a second. His eyes remained locked on the door, his body tense, his ears still tracking something Margaret couldn't hear. She wanted to believe that the approaching officers would put an end to her unease, that the presence outside had been nothing more than a trick of her imagination. But deep down, she knew better. A few minutes later, flashing red and blue lights flickered through her curtains. Margaret slowly stood, her legs stiff from the tension of waiting, and moved toward the door. Ace stayed close, his body brushing against her leg, guiding her as always. She unlocked the door carefully, hesitating for a moment before pulling it open just enough to hear the approaching footsteps. "Ma'am? It's Officer Reynolds with the local PD. Is everything all right?" The voice was calm, steady, professional. Margaret exhaled slowly before responding. I thought I heard someone outside," she admitted. "I don't know if they were just passing through. But my dog." He reacted. There was a brief silence before Reynolds responded. "A dog like him? I trust his instincts." Ace stepped forward slightly, his presence as commanding as ever. Margaret could hear the static from the officer's radio as he spoke to someone on the other end. "No signs of forced entry," he reported. "Checking the perimeter now." His boots crunched against the gravel as he moved away, and Margaret felt a strange mix of relief and lingering unease. What if they found nothing? Would she ever be able to convince herself it was nothing at all? Minutes passed in silence before Reynolds returned. "No sign of anyone now, but there are fresh footprints near your side gate," he said. Margaret felt her stomach tighten. "Probably just a passerby cutting through," the officer continued, but the way his voice lowered told her he wasn't entirely convinced of that himself. Someone had been here. Someone had been watching. Margaret reached down, running her fingers over Ace's head. His body remained stiff, alert. He knew the truth before anyone else did. And as much as she wanted to believe the danger had passed, she also knew this wasn't the end. Whoever had been out there hadn't just stumbled upon her home. They had come for a reason, and Margaret had a terrible feeling that they would be back. Margaret sat motionless in her chair, her fingers gripping the worn fabric of the armrest. Officer Reynolds had tried to reassure her, telling her it was probably nothing, just a passerby, maybe a stray animal, or her imagination playing tricks on her. But she wasn't convinced. She had spent too many years relying on Ace's instincts, and tonight, his reaction had been different. Not cautious, not curious, alert, on guard, ready. Ace was never wrong about danger, and the way he had remained tense even after the supposed threat was gone told Margaret everything she needed to know. Something or someone had been out there, and they had been watching. Reynolds shifted his weight, snapping his notepad shut. "I'll have patrols drive through the area a few times tonight," he said. "If you hear or see anything else, call us right away." His voice remained calm, steady, but there was something underneath. A slight hesitation, a sliver of doubt. He was trying not to alarm her, but he didn't fully believe it was nothing either. Margaret could hear it in his voice, the way his words were measured, carefully chosen. He was concerned. But concern wouldn't be enough if the person who had been outside decided to return. The officer turned toward the front gate, ready to leave, when he suddenly stopped. Margaret heard his footsteps hesitate, then change direction. Ace's ears flicked forward, his body stiffening once more. "Wait a second," Reynolds muttered, his tone shifting from professional to cautious. A pause. Then, more firmly, "Ma'am, has anyone been messing with your fence?" Margaret felt her pulse quicken. "No," she said, keeping her voice even. "Why?" The pause on the other end was longer this time. Then Reynolds finally spoke, his voice lower now, edged with something she hadn't heard before. Concern. "There's a mark here, scratched into the wood. It's fresh." Another pause. This wasn't done by accident. A cold dread settled in Margaret's stomach. Someone hadn't just walked past her house. They had left something behind. A message. Ace let out a quiet but firm exhale, his ears twitching toward the gate as if he could see the mark himself. Margaret didn't need to see it. She could feel it. Whoever had been out there hadn't stumbled onto her property by chance. They had been there for a reason. Reynolds exhaled slowly, his voice firmer now. "Lock your doors. Leave your lights on. If this was meant to scare you, don't let them think it worked." But as Margaret sat there, one hand gripping Ace's leash and the other resting on his back, she knew better. This wasn't just some random act of vandalism. This wasn't over. It was only the beginning. Margaret didn't sleep that night. Even with the lights on, even with Ace stationed by the door, her thoughts refused to settle. The mark on her fence lingered in her mind, a tangible reminder that someone had been watching her, that she had been singled out for reasons she couldn't understand. Her home, the one place that had always felt safe, now felt fragile, vulnerable. Ace hadn't moved from his spot, his body still but his ears flicking toward every sound that broke the silence. Margaret whispered softly to him at one point, "What are we waiting for, boy?" But she already knew the answer. They were waiting for the unknown. When morning finally came, it brought little comfort. The sunlight filtering through the curtains felt thin, pale, as if it couldn't quite dispel the unease that lingered from the night before. Margaret sighed heavily, running her fingers over Ace's head. His fur was warm beneath her touch, grounding her in the present. "Let's go out," she said aloud, more for herself than for him. She needed to reclaim her routine, to remind herself that fear wouldn't control her. Ace stood immediately, ready to face whatever was out there. The neighborhood was waking up around them. Birds chirped in the trees, a car door slammed in the distance, and the faint hum of voices floated through the air. For a brief moment, Margaret almost let herself believe that everything was normal. But Ace's steady, deliberate pace reminded her that things had changed. He was alert, scanning constantly, his movements calculated and purposeful. Margaret held the leash tightly, relying on him to guide her as they walked. But even without her sight, she could feel it, the sensation of being watched. Ace stopped abruptly, his body tensing. Margaret felt the sudden change in his posture, the shift in energy that passed through the leash and into her hand. Her heart quickened. She couldn't see what had caused him to freeze, but she didn't need to. Ace's instincts had never failed her. "Keep walking, boy," she whispered, though her voice trembled slightly. Ace moved again, but his head was tilted, his ears twitching, as if tracking something just out of reach. Then came the sound she had been dreading, the low, throaty growl of a motorcycle engine, far off but distinct. It wasn't just noise. It was a memory, one she wished she could forget. Margaret's stomach turned as the sound grew louder, closer. It was still far enough away that it could be a coincidence, but Margaret knew better. She recognized that engine. The tone, the rhythm. It was his, the man from that night. Ace let out a quiet, restrained huff, his entire body taut. Margaret tightened her grip on the leash, her free hand trembling slightly as it brushed against the fabric of her coat. The man hadn't left that mark on her fence by accident. He had wanted her to feel this way, trapped, hunted. And now, with the growl of his motorcycle echoing in her ears, she realized he was sending her another message. He wasn't finished. Whatever he wanted, it was only just beginning. The sound of the motorcycle grew louder, its deep, rumbling growl sending vibrations through the pavement beneath Margaret's feet. She stopped walking, her hand tightening on Ace's leash. She didn't need to see the road ahead to know who it was. The weight of his presence was undeniable. Ace froze beside her, his body rigid, his sharp gaze fixed on the approaching figure. The leash between them was taut, not from fear, but from Ace's controlled tension. Every muscle in his body prepared for what was to come. Margaret took a slow, steady breath. "Ace," she whispered softly, her voice low and deliberate. "I'm with you." She couldn't see the man, but she could hear him now. The motorcycle slowed, the engine shifting to a low, threatening idle as it pulled up to the curb a few feet away. Her grip on the leash remained firm, her free hand trembling slightly as she reached out to touch Ace's fur. He didn't move, he didn't flinch, but Margaret could feel the heat radiating from his body, every fiber of him poised for action. "Didn't expect to see me again, huh?" the man called out, his voice dripping with smugness. Margaret didn't answer. She focused on her breathing, keeping her fear in check. The man stepped off the motorcycle, his boots crunching against the gravel. "Thought I'd come by and check on you. See if that mutt of yours is as tough as he thinks he is." His tone was mocking, but Margaret could hear the malice beneath it. This wasn't a coincidence. This was planned. Ace let out a low growl, deep and steady. It wasn't a bark or a threat. It was a warning. Margaret placed a hand on his shoulder, her touch grounding him, but it was clear Ace didn't need reassurance. He was in control. The man laughed, a hollow sound. "What's he gonna do? Huh? He's just a dog." Margaret's voice was calm, but firm. "He's more than you'll ever understand." She stood straighter, her grip steady on the leash. She had spent the last few days feeling vulnerable, but now, standing here with Ace at her side, she felt something she hadn't in days. Strength. The man took another step closer, and that was all Ace needed. He didn't lunge or attack. He simply moved forward, his body language shifting from warning to absolute authority. The man stopped in his tracks, caught off guard by the sheer presence of the dog. "You think you can scare me?" The man spat, but his voice faltered. Ace didn't flinch, his intense eyes locked onto the man like a spotlight. Margaret heard the hesitation in his voice and knew he had realized his mistake. This wasn't just a dog. This was Ace, a protector, partner, and in that moment, the man knew he wasn't in control anymore. Without another word, he stepped back, muttering curses under his breath as he climbed onto his bike. The engine roared to life, but Margaret stood her ground. Ace remained still, his gaze unbroken, until the man sped off into the distance. Margaret let out a shaky breath, her hand still on Ace's shoulder. She knelt down beside him, feeling the warmth of his fur and the steady rhythm of his breathing. "You saved me," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. Ace leaned into her touch, his eyes softening. Margaret realized something in that moment. She wasn't just being protected. She was standing beside a partner who would never let her fall. Together, they were unbreakable.